and welcome. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. Today we're going to reflect on the subject of look and live, how our vision transforms us and transforms the world around us. How our vision transforms us and transforms the world around us. And our primary text today will be from Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and we'll be looking at verses 8 through 13. We intend to look at this biblical example. I'll look at an example from my own family, and we will look at one example from the modern civil rights movement in the U.S. In Hebrews, the 11th chapter, at verse 8, these words can be found. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous of the stars in the sky, and countless as the sands on the seashore. All these people were living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. It is amazing how the vision of one person has had such a major impact in the world. Abraham and Sarah, they were a couple that was relatively prosperous by the standards of their society, but they weren't kings and queens. They weren't princes. They weren't warriors. They weren't great generals. They had livestock, and they wandered and they traveled. They were up in years. And yet they had received a vision. They had received a vision, a divinely inspired vision, that through them and through their family, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. They had a big, beautiful vision that somehow through their lineage, through their descendants, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And at the time they had that vision, they had no descendants. They had no children. They had no grandchildren. And they were, again, well up in years, well past the childbearing years. But they had a vision, and it was a vision that put them into action. It's a vision that caused them to pack everything up. It was a vision that caused them to give up their comfort. It was a vision that had them wandering the years of their life. It was a vision that caused them to live in tents and be strangers in a foreign place. It was a vision that drove them to get past all the obstacles and the hardships. It was a vision that actually sustained the family for generations, because they mentioned that Isaac and Jacob also embraced the vision. They also had the idea that somehow through them and their family, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And Isaac and Jacob also lived a life wandering, often living in tents. But they were heirs of the same promise. They still had the same vision. In many cases, in fact, on every case, I believe, it's our vision that transforms us. In Proverbs 29, there's a verse that's been often quoted, and I'll quote it again, that says, without a vision, people perish. Without a vision, people perish. In my experience, many times the difference between people making it and not making it, people being stuck and people overcoming, is the ability to have a vision. I came of age during the crack epidemic. There were many people that had gotten caught up in that world, many people who had gotten caught up as users, but also many people who had gotten caught up in dealing crack and being in gangs and the gang life. And part of what was happening, and part of what they understood, because society's response had been pretty harsh, in that we had mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out, that for people who engaged in that way of life, there were really only 2 outcomes. If you were an active member of the gang, most likely you were going to end up in the cemetery, or you're going to end up incarcerated. And you're going to be incarcerated for a long, long time. And yet many people who still engaged in this life that had no positive outcome, no positive hope. And in many cases, from the things I've read, from the people that I've talked to, from the interviews that I've heard, part of it, and the part of the reason that they were stuck in this is because they just didn't see anything else. They saw the limitations that were stacked against them, of poverty, of de facto desegregation, the lack of education, the lack of access to capital, the lack of just the lack, a general lack, had created a sense of hopelessness where they just couldn't see any better way of life. They knew that the path that they were on would one day lead them to the cemetery or the prison, but they weren't able to see another path that was going to get them a better life. They wanted to enjoy at least something here and now, in this place, in this time, because they didn't have a bigger vision. They didn't have a bigger vision that was able to carry them, that was able to sustain them, that was able to get them through the hard times and get them through the difficult circumstances. See, without a vision, people perish. In the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, there was a whole list of people that were named, men and women, some famous, not some infamous, but they were all people who were able to see the larger vision that God had for them. And it was that larger vision that drove them through adversity, that drove them through difficult circumstances. It was the ability to comprehend that vision and to see it and to welcome it even though it was a long way away. It was that ability that helped to transform the circumstances. Recently, for the last 3 years, I've been involved in a planning committee for my McMillon family reunion. And I think about the vision that my grandparents had. My grandparents were both born before the turn of the 20th century. They were born in the Jim Crow South. My grandparents were migrant farm workers for a portion of their life, a significant portion of their young life, traveling, making their way the best they could, picking crops and moving on from crop to crop and picking those crops across Florida and other places. My grandparents had an elementary school education, and not even that. Formally, according to the census records, my grandfather only completed the 3rd grade. But here, this family, Horace and Addie, born in the Jim Crow South, limited opportunities for education, limited opportunities for employment, dealing with segregation and everything that meant, still had a vision that was uncommon for that time. They had a vision that every single one of their 9 children would finish high school. That is something that drove them, that every single one of their 9 children would finish high school. They said, we don't have anything else to give you, but we can give you an education. Every single one of you will be able to go to high school, and it is our hope that you will be able to attend college, even though we do not have the money to send you. It's our hope that you will also be able to attend college. They had a vision that life could be very, very different. Many people criticize them for actually having their kids in school when their kids could have been doing something helpful. Their kids could have been helping to follow the crops and pick the crops, and the family could have been better off, could have had more food on the table, could have had more clothes, maybe could have had a nicer place to live potentially had all the family been working. But they sacrificed to make sure that each of those 9 children would have a chance to at least complete high school, and completing high school to open up other opportunities as things happened with the GI Bill and other things. And many of my aunts and uncles had a chance. I look at the life that I live and the life of so many of my cousins, third generation, fourth generation. We're all on the planning committee this time. And you just look at all the things that they've achieved. There's entrepreneurs, there's teachers, there's preachers, there's people engaged in every walk of life, many with formal, high levels of formal education, living lives that were not possible to imagine. It wasn't possible, it wasn't a reasonable expectation to focus to a poor black couple, migrant workers who were born in the tail end of the 19th century. But they had a vision that there would be something greater for their family. They had a vision that would be greater greater for their descendants. And that vision drove them. That vision drove them to make the sacrifices that were necessary to see that each and every one of their 9 children completed high school. That was something like less than in Mississippi. I don't have the census records or the records for Florida, but for the similar time period, the census records and the records in Mississippi say that was probably less than 10% of black folks at that time were going to finish high school and go on and have some of those different opportunities. But they had a vision, and they had a vision that their family and that their descendants were going to be able to have a better life, that their descendants were going to be able to have other opportunities, that their descendants were going to be able to make bigger contributions, that the descendants were going to be able to walk through doors. All this was happening years before the big civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 60s, before the Civil Rights Bill, before many of the bills that took place. They were able to look and they were able to live. And because they did, we lived. I believe that many people are living for the weekend, as the popular 80s song went. That many people were just living for the weekend because they didn't have hope that the week was ever going to get any better, that they couldn't see things getting better for them. But when we actually have a vision, a divinely inspired vision, it gives us life. It gives us the ability and the energy to persevere, to go further. The last speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave was called his mountaintop speech. The civil rights movement had become a slog that had gotten a number of major achievements and major victories, but it turned more to looking towards economic equality. As King was once said, the early days of the movement were a little bit easier because a lot of the things that they had requested didn't actually come with a dollar tag, an economic cost. But at this point, they were talking about an opportunity and looking at things that were actually going to transform people economically in their situations, in their circumstances. So in this mountaintop speech, King said that he had been to the mountaintop and he had seen the other side, and that he might not get there with them, but he knew that we as a people would get there one day. The vision of going to the mountaintop and seeing the other side and seeing what's possible was something that was transformational in King's life. Going to the mountaintop and having a vision and looking and seeing was transformational. And even though he did not receive this vision, he did not live in the world that he had a chance to see. It was the vision that carried him. It was the vision that caused him to sustain and endure through all the difficulties, through all the hardships, through all the circumstances. And part of the mountaintop speech, he actually recounted some of the things that they overcame during this. He talked about the march and going up against Bull Connor back in Alabama, and how they sent the dogs. After they sent the dogs, they sent the water hoses. How they were locked up and put into prison, put into jail. But the vision was big enough that it actually sustained them and transformed them. One of the passages of the text that I think of when it says to look and live also comes from Numbers, the 21st century. The people of Israel were mired in the wilderness, and they had become very toxic in many ways, and their thinking and their environment had turned toxic. There were toxic snakes that were coming to bite them, and many folks were dying. And so Moses had put up a big bronze serpent, and when people could look at the serpent, they could be healed, they could be cured. They had a chance to look and live. Jesus in the Gospel of John thought of his life as similar. Is that that he was one day going to be crucified and executed. But when people could look and see that vision and see the vision that he had and the vision of his life, that they too could be saved through that. The text of the Gospel of John ends up calling it believing, but here the believing is really a type of vision, a type of seeing, a type of understanding where we look and we live. See, when we have a vision for ourselves, that vision, if it's big enough and meaningful enough and purposeful enough, will give us the motivation to endure. It will give us the motivation to persevere in the face of the biggest obstacles, in the face of in the face of our uncertainties. Abraham persevered. Sarah persevered, even though they didn't know where they were going. They gave up a relatively comfortable life to live an uncomfortable life, traveling around, living in tents, in a foreign lands where they were strangers. Their children also embraced that vision, overcoming significant difficulties and uncertainties. When I think about my grandparents and the vision that they had for their family, and I truly believe it was a divinely inspired vision. They were people of faith. My grandfather was a minister, and my grandmother was very active in the church and other things. They had a vision that things could be different, and that things would be different. And that actually drove them through the hardships. It drove them through the Great Depression. It drove them through Jim Crow. It drove them through the discrimination that they faced on a daily single basis. And it caused them to make positive decisions and significant sacrifices that were going to cause the world and the time to be bigger. Having a vision caused the folks Martin Luther King and all those who participated in the civil rights, to endure the hardships of the water hoses and the dogs and the jail cells and people spitting on them and mocking them and the assassin's bullet and the bombs. The vision gave them a life that was bigger and more meaningful than the obstacles that they faced. We have to be the type of people that welcome the vision from afar. Even though at times it seems like we're strangers in a foreign land, we welcome the vision because we believe the one who is faithful, who gave us the vision. As Sarah, she believed that she could give birth, even though she was past childbearing age, because she believed the person who was faithful, and that was God. We believe that God is faithful, and because of that, we believe that we can overcome even in the most difficult circumstances. In this particular chapter in human history, we face a lot of obstacles and we face a lot of difficulties. We live in a time of incredible polarization. We live in a time of risk in terms of their global and environmental challenges. We live in a time where there's warfare and conflict. We live in a time that is full of growing economic inequality. We live in a time that's filled with all sorts of challenges, where it's hard to see how folks are going to make it through, how a regular person's going to get by, and how a poor person's going to make it at all. But when we look and we live and we embrace the vision, when we embrace the vision that God has for us, that Jesus articulated, in a world in which God's will is done on earth as it is done in heaven, in a world when even the daily worker actually has wages for their daily bread, when we embrace that vision of the world, when we embrace the vision of a world when we're not judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, when we embrace the vision of the world, when the children of former slave owners and the children of former slaves are able to walk hand in hand, when we embrace that vision of the world, it transforms us, and it transforms our life, and it transforms the circumstances. See, if we don't have a vision, we're going to perish. We're going to perish in our cynicism. We're going to perish in our despair. We're going to perish in our circumstances, and there won't be transformation. But when we look and when we see the vision, when we welcome it from afar, it transforms us and it transforms the world. Look and live. Peace be with you.